to find a way to make sure your wife ain't talking about your private business.
I'm going on a book tour this fall for my new memoir, Worthy. This was a labor of love. I will be coming to New York. I will be going.
There's a question that's been quietly burning through Hollywood for weeks now, and it's not just about Diddy's legal collapse or the shocking testimony pouring out of his case. It's about why Jada Pinkett Smith keeps surfacing at the center of it all. Because when CNN airs a segment framing Jada as one of Diddy's most vocal defenders at the exact moment his empire is imploding under human trafficking convictions and freak-off horror stories, that doesn't feel like coincidence. It feels like a signal that something deeper is happening behind closed doors. Then things get even stranger when Gene Deal, Diddy's former bodyguard, drops a story so outrageous it forces you to rethink who's really been pulling strings all these years. According to Deal, it happened at an ultra-exclusive birthday party for Ben Affleck, hosted by Matt Damon, the kind of A-list room where power, ego, and money collide. J.Lo was there. Diddy was there. And so were Will and Jada Smith, moving through the room like the untouchable power couple they've always presented themselves to be. But Deal says the energy shifted fast, with Diddy suddenly going tense, leaning into his security and saying, "Yo, I think Will and Jada are trying to scoop up Jennifer. Stay close, 'cause I'ma snuff him." That phrase wasn't casual trash talk. Scoop up Jennifer wasn't vague flirting. It was an accusation of aggressive advances toward J.Lo, the kind that pushed even someone like Diddy, a man deeply familiar with street politics, into issuing a real threat. Not posturing, not ego. A genuine warning that lines were being crossed, and that whatever was happening in that room went far beyond celebrity gossip and straight into the shadowy power games Hollywood never wants exposed.
Big. It wasn't only Tupac, you understand? For the atmosphere that he put those kids in. You got a guy named Anthony Wolf Jones, who was from Bad Boy, from its conception as doing security and being one of the financiers of Puff having to have some money to keep Big and Craig Mack around.
So what happens next is where things get even more unsettling, because Gene Deal says he stayed close, ready to step in if Diddy actually took a swing at Will Smith, and that alone tells you this wasn't some harmless ego clash. This was a moment where one of the most powerful figures in hip-hop felt compelled to physically assert dominance over another global icon, all over the belief that Will and Jada were crossing a line with Jennifer Lopez. And that raises the real question. Why would Diddy care that much unless something deeper was at play, unless the Smiths weren't just flirting but moving within a circle where boundaries like monogamy, loyalty, and even basic decency are blurred into something transactional? That question only gets louder when you look at the present moment, with Jada Pinkett Smith emerging as one of the few public figures still standing by Diddy as his world collapses under allegations of exploitation, coercion, and the infamous freak-off sessions described in court testimony as days-long marathons involving flown-in companions. Coincidence doesn't explain that kind of loyalty, not when the rest of Hollywood is running for cover, which is why so many people are asking whether Jada isn't just defending a friend, but helping manage fallout from a world she knows far more about than anyone is willing to admit.
Was the woman that everybody wanted, and Will needed that validation to have that.
Now let's talk about the Smiths' marriage, because if anyone thought their red table talk confessions were the height of oversharing, this goes even further. Will Smith has spent years framing their relationship as some enlightened, boundary-free love experiment, where trust supposedly means giving each other permission to explore, wander, and redefine fidelity in whatever way keeps them happy. In a GQ interview, he even admitted to fantasizing about having a harem of girlfriends, casually naming Misty Copeland and Halle Berry as part of that dream lineup, before claiming his intimacy coach had to walk him back by explaining how destructive that fantasy really was. But Will's version of transparency has always come with limits. He's willing to air out his desires on glossy magazine covers. Yet the moment someone from his inner circle starts telling stories he can't control, the lawyers get involved. That's exactly what happened with brother Bilal, his former assistant and self-described closest friend, who didn't just hint at rumors but went on Tasha K's podcast and gave a graphic account of allegedly walking in on Will and actor Dwayne Martin in a dressing room, describing the situation as intense and disturbing, and claiming he witnessed something that left Dwayne hurting badly. That's when the narrative stopped being about openness and started looking a lot more like selective truth. Openness on Will's terms, silence enforced everywhere else.
Will was bent over on the couch and Dwayne was standing up. Like, murder. There was murder in there.
Now pause on that image for a moment, because if even part of it were true, and to be clear, Will's team insists the claims are completely fabricated, then we're no longer talking about a simple affair, but about a dynamic so intense and visceral that it would fundamentally rewrite everything people think they know about Will Smith's carefully crafted public persona. What made the situation even more unsettling was Jada's response. Not firm denial, not visible outrage, but a dismissal that framed it as a money grab, as if Brother Bilal's willingness to double down and threaten to release evidence unless she sued first was nothing more than the bitterness of a former friend. But Bilal isn't some random hanger-on. He's someone who claims to have known Will for nearly 4 decades and is now suing Jada for $3 million, alleging she threatened him with violence, warned him he could end up missing or shot if he kept talking, and sent people to intimidate him into signing an NDA. That stops looking like a personal fallout and starts resembling a pattern. One that mirrors how people inside Diddy's world describe his inner circle, where loyalty is enforced through fear and silence isn't optional, it's the cost of survival.
Now, Bilal has filed a $3 million lawsuit against Jada, claiming that she basically threatened, it comes across like a threat.
But this is where the contradiction becomes impossible to ignore, because for years the Smiths have carefully cultivated an image built on radical honesty. Jada's memoir Worthy openly detailed their 7-year separation, her entanglement with August Alsina, and the idea that their marriage was never about possession but about growth, while Will has repeatedly framed their bond as something so evolved that even infidelity couldn't threaten it. Yet when the allegations shift to Dwayne Martin, a man Will has known since the Fresh Prince era and reportedly loaned $1.4 million to during serious legal trouble, that philosophy of transparency suddenly disappears. Instead of openness, there are threats, lawsuits, and tightly controlled messaging, with Jada laughing it off on The Breakfast Club as background noise and Will remaining silent while his team dismisses everything as unequivocally false, without addressing any specifics. So the question writes itself. Are the Smiths truly pioneers of a boundary-breaking version of love where truth always comes first, or are they simply masters at controlling the narrative until voices like Brother Bilal, and now Gene Deal, force the curtain open and expose what they've worked so hard to keep hidden?
Knows that this is part of my healing journey. Will has been completely supportive of this book.
And this is where the timing starts to feel impossible to ignore, because as Diddy's trial peels back a world of alleged freak-offs, coercion, and abuse, with Cassie Ventura testifying about trafficking and blackmail and Jane Doe describing a gilded cage disguised as luxury, Jada Pinkett Smith's name keeps resurfacing in the most uncomfortable ways. Suddenly, Diddy's former bodyguard is recounting stories about Will, and Jada allegedly making moves on J.Lo, while Jada's past red table talk conversations about polyamory, freedom, and non-traditional love take on a far more unsettling tone when viewed alongside the allegations surrounding their inner circle. Add to that Terrence Howard's blunt claims about the same puffy parties where men allegedly lost their man card, gatherings the Smiths have been linked to for years, and his assertion that young men fled those environments in terror, naming figures like Meek Mill and Brisher Gray in the process. Gray's story only deepens the unease. Once mentored by Will, publicly embraced as a little brother, now rumored to be suing Diddy and Will for $50 million over alleged coercion tied to those same freak-off sessions, while simultaneously spiraling into a personal collapse marked by domestic abuse charges so severe his ex-wife reportedly had to beg a stranger to call 911. It forces an uncomfortable question. How does someone go from being a celebrated protege under one of Hollywood's most powerful figures to a man so fractured he's allegedly lashing out at women, unless something inside that mentorship, that environment, that circle, broke him long before the public ever saw the damage?
I'm sorry, I'm just like really, I'm in this moment right now. This is crazy. Sorry. People don't really know how much what it does to you when something that you love is taken from you and thrown away like it don't even matter, and then they move on with their lives and you're stuck. You're stuck during those years. You're still stuck.
But this is where the Smith story starts to feel less like a celebrity scandal and more like a cautionary tale. Because while Will and Jada have branded themselves as champions of radical authenticity and boundary-free love, it's their children who seem left to navigate the consequences. Jaden has spoken openly about being introduced to psychedelics by his mother as a teenager, the same substances Jada credits with saving her from deep depression, while Willow, at just 20, declared herself polyamorous on national television, framing it as liberation as her grandmother sat visibly stunned. Moments like Jaden's viral, brotherly Coachella kiss with Justin Bieber only added fuel to years of rumors about an open household where boundaries appear to dissolve once the cameras stop rolling. And taken together, it raises uncomfortable questions about whether it's really coincidence that the family preaching love without limits has a son who's become emblematic of a generation grappling with identity, substances, and the crushing weight of growing up under a microscope, or a daughter whose views on marriage sound less like youthful experimentation and more like a direct echo of her parents' most controversial beliefs.
The filth that's starting to come out in the early days of the Diddy trial, this of course is P. Diddy. Surprise, surprise, he's a creep. Surprise, surprise, he's done horrible.
Now let's circle back to Diddy, because this is where the story stops feeling like celebrity chaos and starts to feel genuinely dangerous, as his trial didn't just expose alleged crimes but revealed a culture where power isn't about money or fame, it's about control, deciding what happens in the dark and who gets sacrificed when the lights come on. Cassie's testimony described a man who weaponized intimacy, turning freak-offs into leverage, blackmail, and fear, ensuring that the people around him were too compromised to ever walk away. And when you listen to Brother Bilal describe the Smiths' inner circle, the threats, the NDAs, the way dissent is handled, it sounds like the same playbook with different names attached. In that framing, Jada isn't just a bystander. According to Bilal, she was the one who allegedly arrived with her entourage to enforce silence, the same woman who writes in her memoir about sacrifices made for legacy, and who now appears publicly aligned with Diddy as his empire burns while much of Hollywood pretends the smoke was never there. That leads to the question few seem willing to ask. What if the Smiths aren't simply another celebrity family navigating controversy, but a living example of the very culture Diddy's downfall is exposing? One where loyalty is performative, freedom doubles as secrecy, and the loudest advocates of love have the most to protect. When you step back and look at the pattern, the lawsuits, the NDAs, the carefully controlled narratives that only fracture when outsiders force them into the open, it begins to feel less like a marriage and more like a machine, expertly turning chaos into brand value until the chaos grows too large to contain. And now, with that pressure building, the real question isn't whether the image will crack, but how long it can hold before collapsing entirely, and who will still be standing when it does. Because at that point the Smith story stops looking like family drama and starts reading like a blueprint for elite survival, where healing and manipulation blur together so completely that you can't tell whether the architects are pioneers or predators.
So he put his hands on females, put his hands on producers, executives. That's just his. I guess that's what the whole name Bad Boy comes from. That people don't really understand. What is it? What is a bad boy? Why did he choose that name? Like he never really gave a clear definition of how he feels about it.
It's about the way Jada frames all of this as some revolutionary act of maternal care. Even as the world watches young stars like Jaden drift into behaviors that look less like enlightenment and more like a quiet cry for help. Jada has been open about her own battles with mental health and how psychedelics, in her words, saved her when therapy and medication failed. A narrative that on the surface sounds brave, even noble. But then you hear Jaden, now 25, casually explain that his mother was the first to introduce magic mushrooms into their family, that it spread naturally until everyone found their own path, and suddenly the timeline feels unsettling. The same substances Jada credits with her rebirth are the ones her son says he was exposed to at an age when most kids are still learning algebra, all while he later struggled publicly with erratic behavior. Add in Will's own admissions of undergoing more than a dozen ayahuasca sessions in just 2 years, describing ego dissolution as the key to his resilience, and a darker question emerges, because ego dissolution doesn't just erase pain, it erodes boundaries, instincts, and the internal brakes that stop people from crossing lines they can't uncross. That's why Terrence Howard's comments about puffy parties land so hard. His claim that men lose their man card in exchange for access and approval sounding less like exaggeration and more like a warning, especially when he insists that once that card is gone, it's gone for good. And when you stack that against a family that spent decades moving through the same elite spaces, preaching freedom while their inner circle shrinks, their stories grow more guarded, and their legal threats more aggressive, it forces an uncomfortable reckoning about whether this was ever about healing at all, or about adapting to a culture where compromise is the price of belonging.
Afraid of coming forward. They've been afraid of what he could potentially do to them within the industry, what he could do to them professionally, maybe even personally. And so yes, it's been a dark secret they've held on to for a very, very long time.
Briar Gray's story is the thread that makes all of this deeply unsettling, because he wasn't just another rising actor. He was a young man mentored by Will Smith, boosted into empire through Will's connections, and publicly framed his family, only to end up behind bars with his career destroyed and his personal life imploding under domestic violence charges, so severe his ex-wife reportedly fled for her safety. The official narrative paints him as a gifted talent who simply couldn't handle fame, but that explanation starts to crack when you factor in the whispers and blind items alleging he was forced into the same freak-off sessions tied to Diddy and Will, environments where consent allegedly blurred and power ruled everything. Add the rumored $50 million lawsuit said to be in the works, one that could finally attach real names to years of rumors, and the question shifts from what Gray did to what happened to him, because if his crimes are the symptom, then what exactly was the disease, and how early was it planted when he was brought into a world where mentorship may have meant something far darker? That's where the Smith legacy begins to look less like a love story and more like a warning, especially when you line it up with Jaden's public struggles with substances, Willow declaring herself polyamorous at 20, and those red table talk conversations about love and freedom that now sound less like wisdom and more like rationalization. These aren't isolated choices, they feel like the inevitable outcome of a household where rules were always fluid, accountability was optional, and authenticity meant never having to apologize, all while the adults proudly told the world they were rewriting the rules of marriage, parenting, and family. And the most chilling part is this: if these are the things they're willing to admit, the psychedelics, the open relationships, the entanglements, what are they still hiding? Especially when they didn't just live in Hollywood but thrived in its darkest corners, where the real currency isn't fame or money, but silence. As Diddy's trial is proving, silence is the one thing these circles can no longer afford, and when the lawsuits fade, the memoirs stop selling, and the comeback tours end, the real question will be what's left of the Smiths' legacy. Pioneers of a new kind of love, or proof of how easily love can be weaponized, because the more they talk about freedom, the more it sounds like a cage, and the real danger isn't whether they survive the storm, but who gets pulled under with them when it's finally over.